Now that we have covered four-directional shading and practicing pressure, it is time to move on to what we call circular shading or smooth shading. Notice in the four-directional technique, you still see lines and movement. You see the stroke of your pencil. You still have white gaps showing through. And though this may at times during a pencil drawing be a texture you want, our main goal in shading with pencil, in shading with any material, is to just accentuate form. We don't want to distract the viewer from the form we are creating with our pencil movements. So this is where circular shading, smooth shading techniques help us accentuate form. So circular shading is a small movement with our pencil point in a small circular motion. So when I apply it, I'm moving my pencil point in a very tight, small circle. I combine that with overlapping. So I just don't create the circles and move across my paper. I backtrack. I overlap. The circular shading motion allows us to hit all four directions of our paper, of the fibers of our paper, just like in the four-directional technique. But notice already it's a smoother, cleaner value. We're not picking up as much of the pencil movement. We're not picking up the strokes used to create and lay down that value. I also look for if I accidentally applied too much pressure in an area. So then I can go back, overlap, and try to match that pressure. So again, I am creating a solid filled-in space of gray. Even though this technique does take longer, it is a proper shading technique, but more importantly, it allows, again, as I said, the shading to accentuate the form. It doesn't draw attention to the fact that you took a pencil and applied the graphite to the paper, because the viewer's not going to pay attention to the motion. It doesn't distract the viewer from seeing the form. So some things you don't want to do in circular shading is, number one, and it's very tempting, you don't want to use the side of your pencil. The side of your pencil doesn't allow for as much pressure, even if you press hard. Because you're using the side, you're using a wider amount of surface across the surface of our paper. So with a pencil point, it allows you to hit and fill in all those little nooks and crannies we talked about in four-directional shading. To give you a visual, this is what I mean by nooks and crannies. This is a piece of paper in a macro view. So you'll notice paper is just made up of fibers, and these fibers are pressed together. When you hit in a four-directional technique, you may only hit certain edges of those fibers. With the circular shading, I'm grinding that graphite down into those fibers. So when I use just the side of my pencil, it would be the same as just skimming the surface. Okay? So pencil points are important. So don't just use the side of your pencil. The second don't is to be tempted to use large ovals. The problem with that is, notice the white gaps you start out with. So then even if you constantly overlap, it's not getting better. You can still see the movement of the pencil, the stroke. I have some very dark areas, some very light areas. I still have some white gaps. I'm coming outside of my lines. And circular shading is meant for more control. This is why we use it also, is as you are shading a certain area on an object, you want to have control as to where that graphite will lay down. So don't make large ovals. And the last don't is to be tempted to create rows. So even if you use small circular motion, and even if you're not leaving white gaps in between, if you just create row side by side by side, do you notice what's happening? Only this little edge where they overlap is getting all the graphite down into all those fibers. So this again creates an unintentional texture. So do not do rows. So your biggest do is the motion, small motion. Your second do is to overlap often. So just don't start in an area and move away from it. Constantly backtrack, even out surfaces as you shade. And this will create a more even, filled in gray value. Okay, so overlap. You are once again going to create a 3, a 5, and an 8-step value. Here's an example of a 3-step value. Notice, compared to the 4-directional shading technique, how much more solid and filled those boxes look. And this is an example of an almost complete 8-step value. So I am working on my darkest value right now. Just like in the 4-directional, you do want to be careful with your darkest value in that you don't want to apply so much pressure that you damage the paper. If it starts to get wavy, if you notice there's movement in the surface of the paper, it starts to dig in, it starts to buckle up, that's too much pressure. Now with this technique, it will take a lot longer to master it. So even though you have to complete a 3, a 5, and an 8-step value scale, I encourage you to create many of those value scales. So if you start a 3-step value scale and you have any troubles, skip a space or go down to another row and try it again. By the time you reach your 8-step value, it should be the best possible shading.